I want to thank you for joining me today. We're going to be talking about reACT. reACT stands for Rapid Eccentric Anaerobic Core Trainer. And we're going to be doing some education on what eccentric training is all about, and then specifically reACT and functional eccentric training. And in order to understand what eccentric training is all about, we have to understand muscular contraction. And there are three types of muscular contractions that the muscles in your body can perform. First is concentric, where the muscle is shortening under tension. Second is isometric, where there's tension in the muscle without any change in the length of the muscle. And then there's eccentric, which is also known as a negative muscle contraction, where the muscle is actually lengthening under tension. So this slide depicts very nicely those three different contractions. Starting with the top here that you can see me circling, you've got the bicep. There's tension in the bicep because the arm is holding up the dumbbell, but there's no movement in the bicep or the arm, so it's an isometric contraction. In a concentric contraction, the bicep is getting shorter, and we've got the weight being curled up against gravity, and that is a concentric contraction of the bicep. In the third condition down here, we're doing the eccentric contraction, and the muscle's actually lengthening. So if you compare this to this, the muscle's lengthening, and we're lowering the weight back down. So what does this mean? What does it have to do with human movement and how we condition people? Concentric contractions occur whenever you're projecting force externally, such as these examples, where anytime we're lifting any object against gravity, like in the instance of a dumbbell, when the dumbbell's going up against gravity, it's being done so with a concentric contraction. Whenever you're performing an exercise on a machine where there's a weight stack and the weight stack is moving up, that is a concentric muscle contraction. And a good example is a chest press. When you're pushing the bar or bars or handles away from the chest and the weight stack is moving up, that's concentric. When you're lowering back down as the handle is coming closer to the chest muscles are still being worked. They're controlling the lengthening of the muscle under the weight as it returns to the starting position. Whenever you throw anything, you're doing so concentrically. So I throw a ball, a javelin, I throw a punch for that matter. Whenever I'm projecting that force, it's happening concentrically. Whenever I'm jumping up or to the sides or forward or backward for that matter, that's happening concentrically whenever I'm pushing off in the jump phase. The push-off phase of running or walking is another time where I'm using concentric muscle contractions. Now, isometric contractions occur whenever you are stabilizing or preventing movement, such as the rotator cuff muscles of the shoulder. They're small muscles that attach from the torso to the head of the upper arm. The head of the upper arm is the head of the humerus, and they're holding the head of the humerus into a little socket, which is called a glenoid fossa, and they're holding it there while larger muscles like your pectoral muscles or your upper back muscles like your latissimus dorsi are moving the upper arm. These smaller muscles are isometrically contracting to maintain the head of the humerus into that spot. Another great example of isometric muscle contractions in human movement is that typically your torso musculature, meaning your abdominal, low back musculature in particular, and the muscles along the side of your body, contract isometrically a lot of the time. So they're working isometrically because they're maintaining the core in rigid alignment during most movements such as lifting something heavy, jumping, throwing, etc. So they're active, but most of the time these muscles in the core are active in a isometric fashion. Now, eccentric contractions are happening all the time too. They happen whenever you're absorbing force and you're decelerating. Decelerating just means slowing down. So whenever you land from a jump or when your foot lands when you're running or walking, that's happening eccentrically. So as you land when you run, as the foot lands, you first have to absorb before you push off. That absorption or deceleration is happening how? Eccentrically. The muscles are lengthening slightly under tension. This is happening whenever you walk downstairs or walk down a hill, whenever you cut or change direction rapidly while running, which happens all the time in all sorts of sports. You have to decelerate in order to change direction. That is happening how? That's happening eccentrically. So when you stop quickly when you're running, a great example is if you're playing tennis and you're along the baseline, someone hits a short shot right over the net. You have to rush the net to get the shot. You're going to run up, but before you can hit the ball, you have to stop. You're going to have to decelerate, and you do that eccentrically. Absorbing bumps while you're skiing, another great example. When you're skiing and you hit a bump, your knees have to come up and you have to control as your body goes into that squat position. You have to control that and then extend afterwards, and as you're hitting the bump, you're absorbing it, and that's happening eccentrically. Same thing when you're throwing or punching. When you throw something at the end of the throw, after the ball or whatever you're throwing leaves your hand, the muscles, some of the muscles in your upper back attached to the upper arm actually have to contract eccentrically to prevent the arm from continuing to move forward. So they're decelerating the arm after that acceleration. So whenever you accelerate, you have to decelerate. That deceleration is occurring eccentrically. And this is something that is happening all the time. The muscles are really functioning to some extent like springs in human movement. This example here is showing a man and a deer, and as the man is walking down the hill, the muscles of the quadricep here are acting as brakes, and he's literally using them like a spring to absorb his weight as he goes down the hill. Same thing with the deer. When the deer lands, the deer is absorbing the energy, and then after the deer absorbs the energy, it's going to project the energy, and that is called the stretch shortening cycle, which we'll talk about more in a moment. So muscles as springs. During most movement, the eccentric contractions allow us to store kinetic energy, which is then used during the concentric contractions, which tend to happen right after that. This process is ubiquitous, meaning it's happening all the time, and it's known as the stretch shortening cycle, or SSC for short. Up to 50% of all the energy needed to accelerate or lift the body can be reclaimed from the eccentric muscle lengthening phase of a stride. So in the case of walking or running or walking down the hill, you're loading energy into that muscle like a spring, and then as you push off, you're reclaiming, you're using that energy to explode. So eccentrics are happening all the time, and they're very important. The stronger you are eccentrically, the more energy, the more force that you can absorb into the spring of the muscle, so to speak, the stronger you can push off. And the more force you can absorb without getting injured, well, the advantage of that is obvious. You won't get injured. So your ability to absorb and control forces is critical to prevention of injury. It's also critical to your ability to be explosive. One of the interesting things about this slide, this is a force velocity curve. And what it's depicting on the screen, if you watch my mouse here, we're going to look at this side of it. And this is the concentric side, the muscle shortening side. So what you're seeing is that the faster, this is the rate of shortening, so how quickly the muscle is shortening. The faster the muscle is shortening, so the faster it's contracting, look what happens. The lower the force is. So the faster you move, the less force you can produce if a muscle is shortening. But if we look at the other side, and this is the eccentric side, and this is the rate of lengthening, because remember, during an eccentric contraction, the muscle is lengthening under tension. Here's what's interesting. It's just the opposite. So the faster the muscle lengthens, the more force it's capable of producing up to a certain speed. So it's very important to remember this. This is a real significant difference, and we'll talk about how we can do this. One of the most important things here about this to understand is you have to be able to do this quickly, because if you're moving quickly, you're landing from a jump, or you're running and stopping, if you can't produce a lot of force quickly, you're in trouble. So that's built into the system for you to be able to produce more force at a rapid speed. But this also says something about the way we're going to condition people for positive adaptations in eccentric strength and endurance. There's something called the Elfman Principle, and this ranks muscles based upon their inherent level of force production, the muscle contractions. Muscles can produce the lowest amount of force concentrically. So when the muscle shortens, it can produce the least amount of force in that way. The same muscle can produce more force isometrically. So any muscle has more force production capacity in an isometric fashion. But the strongest place for the muscles, the place where the muscles can produce the most force, is eccentrically. To give you some numbers, if you could, let's say, use the curl, if you can curl, let's say, 100 pounds one single time, you can probably lower upwards of 150 pounds under control. And we've all experienced this. You're a lot stronger lowering a weight or eccentrically than you are concentrically. So let's remember that. During eccentric contraction, force comes from contractile elements in the muscles, just like it does for isometric and concentric, but it also comes from the viscoelastic components of the connective tissue. What does that mean? It means that we're going to get help from the connective tissue in terms of the amount of force we can produce when we're doing an eccentric contraction. It's going to contribute. That's not true during concentric or isometric, and this is one of the reasons that we can produce more force during an eccentric contraction. It also tells us that there's a different characteristic of tendon and connective tissue loading going on during an eccentric contraction, and we'll talk about what that means in another slide. So length tension curve. What is the length tension curve? The length tension curve, we're going to see a picture of it. It's how much force a muscle can produce at different lengths. Eccentric training tends to increase a muscle's ability to produce force at longer lengths. Now this is a big deal because this is probably one of the most significant ways that eccentric training prevents injury. A lot of injury happens when the muscle is at the end of its range of motion. We don't tend to hurt in the beginning or middle. We get hurt when we exceed the muscle's ability to control position, and that tends to happen most frequently when we have a muscle at a longer length. And so one of the ways that eccentric training assists in prevention of injury is by moving that length tension curve. We're going to see that in just a second. So if you look at these two curves up on the string, first of all, this is strength and this is length. In a standard training, what we've got from training is, in the red there, what you see is that this is the length tension curve. So as the muscle's getting longer, it's very short here. As it's getting longer, it reaches peak, and then as it continues to get longer, it progressively gets weaker. But notice what happens from eccentric training. We move that length tension curve out, which means the muscle can produce more force at longer lengths from eccentric training. This is very, very important for injury protection. How does all this happen from eccentric exercise? Well, one of the things we think is going on, and that scientists believe is happening based upon the research, is that eccentric exercise is thought to optimize the alignment of myofibrils. Now, myofibrils are the actual contractile elements within muscle fibers. And by aligning them properly, it allows for maximum leverage. So it's literally changing the structure within the muscles. This helps to explain the benefits of eccentric exercise in the treatment of tendinitis. Eccentric exercise causes hypertrophy of tendons and connective tissue, increasing the tendons and the muscles' strength, resistance to injury, and its ability to store energy during movement so that we can reclaim it during concentric. Very, very important. Eccentric versus concentric training. Eccentric training causes more rapid increases in muscle strength and size than concentric or isometric training. Strength from eccentric training tends to carry over to concentric training, but not the other way around. So if we train eccentrically properly, it's going to carry over to the concentric, the muscle shortening phase, but if we train concentrically, which is what 95% of the people only do, we're not going to get much strength carryover or endurance carryover to eccentric function, which is why we see a lot of injuries, and it's a big hole in our conditioning and training programs. So this third bullet here is very, very important. Since a muscle can produce much more force eccentrically, remember we established that you're much stronger eccentrically, simply lowering your weight slowly does not do much to overload or improve eccentric strength. Now remember, the other thing we talked about is the slower we move, the lower the force production eccentrically. So if we pick a weight that we can lift concentrically, it is by definition too light to be real meaningful eccentrically. So if we wanted to use a weight machine to train concentrically and eccentrically, the machine would have to have the ability to increase the resistance substantially, 40 or 50%, during the eccentric phase. or we'd have to move more rapidly during the eccentric phase, because remember, as we move more rapidly, if you remember that force velocity curve, as we move more rapidly, we can produce more force. So if we lower your standard weight slowly, the take-home message here is it does very little to condition eccentrically, and that's what most people are doing to try to condition eccentrically, but it's not going to work. Eccentric training requires a much lower level of oxygen and cardiovascular work or stress, and a lower rate of perceived exertion for any given level of force production or workload. Very, very important. What this means is if I do a certain amount of work eccentrically, the lower rate of perceived exertion means it'll feel easier than if I was doing that same work concentrically, and the lower level of oxygen and cardiovascular work or stress means that when I'm doing that same amount of work eccentrically, there's not as much stress on my cardiovascular system. Why do we care? Well, there's a lot of people out there who have compromised cardiovascular systems who can get injured from too much stress during strength training. So it makes it difficult to get these folks stronger, and we're talking usually about folks that are much older. They have sarcopenia, which is muscle loss. They may have had surgery, and these folks really need to regain strength. And so if we can have a modality that's going to be effective at strengthening them without providing too much stimulus cardiovascularly, we have a real winner. So that's what eccentric training does very, very nicely. So it's a great fit for deconditioned folks as well as highly conditioned folks. And this slide's going to depict that really well. Up here we have muscle force, and here we have metabolic cost. So the farther we got this way, the more cardiovascular stress that there is. So notice for any given metabolic cost here, if we take any point, if we take this point, there's a certain amount of muscular stress, muscle force that I can produce with that metabolic cost. So what you notice is for any amount of metabolic cost, I have a much higher muscle force. If we flip that on its side, it's the same thing. What it means is that for any given amount of muscle force, there's less cardiovascular overload on the individual. This is a depiction of what we were talking about in the previous slide, letting you know that it's going to be safer to work people with diminished cardiovascular capacity for strength training by doing so eccentrically compared to concentrically. There are some concerns with eccentric training that we want to be aware of. Eccentric training can cause significant what's called delayed onset muscular soreness, or DOMS for short. It also causes acute decreases in strength and an acute reduction in proprioceptive ability. That means acute means short term, before the system has had a chance to recover from the stress of the exercise. So proprioceptive ability is the ability to judge where your body is in space relative to things around you and where one body part is in relation to the other. So short term, both strength and proprioceptive ability will be decreased from a serious eccentric training session. Now, we want to be careful with that at certain times, like before an athlete played a game, that would not be a good time to have that occur, or with a senior who could potentially fall from this. And how do we avoid this? The key is a gradual introduction and increase in the interval time, how much time they're working eccentrically, and in the total eccentric loading time, which is how long is the entire eccentric loading we've done. Not long for the interval and not too much time initially, total time, and then keep the increases slow and gradual on the intensity and load side during eccentric training. That way we can slowly ramp up and we can avoid having concerns with that issue. There is a myth regarding delayed onset muscular soreness, and that is that if you train a sore muscle, it's going to hurt recovery. The conclusion that these three studies had on this matter, 1, 2, and 3, looked at just this, and they all concluded the same thing. That's not the case. In fact, exercising a sore muscle may help it actually to recover more rapidly. The other good news about eccentric training is after you've gotten sore, if you keep at it very quickly, you'll never get sore again. This is called the repeated bout effect, in that your body adapts very quickly, and as long as you keep doing it on a regular basis, you're never going to get that kind of soreness again, which is showing you that the muscular and tendon system has become much, much stronger very rapidly. Eccentric training and anterior cruciate ligament injury. ACL, for short, is anterior cruciate ligament tears, are very serious. They frequently require surgery and rehabilitation, and the ACL rehab is challenging. You'll see professional athletes like football players experiencing 9 to 12 months before they can get back on the field, so just imagine what it does to a regular person. Research shows that appropriate eccentric exercise for ACL rehabilitation is not only well tolerated, but it greatly accelerates the increases in muscle mass, strength, and in hopping ability compared to regular exercise. This is a really big deal because it's a very common injury. So as you see in this slide on the left side of the screen here, and this is depicting what happened during the course of rehabilitation using eccentric training, what you notice is that as the person here is going through their eccentric training, if you follow me here, their ability to do eccentric work, they're calling it negative work, but that's eccentric work, is rapidly increasing over the 12-week period. At the same time, the strength's increasing. Look what's happening. The knee pain is decreasing, and the thigh pain is decreasing. So this is exactly what we want to have happen. On the other side of the slide here, it's just showing you the actual comparison to regular rehab versus using the eccentric rehab, and what you see here is that eccentric rehab produces much bigger changes much more rapidly compared to traditional rehabilitation techniques for ACL. Another thing to understand about eccentric exercise is not just good for athletes, it's not just good for rehabilitation, it's not just good for a senior population, which is good for all those groups. It's also good for health benefits, and specifically what this slide is referring to is a study that was done with diabetics, and they did 1 weekly half-hour session of eccentric exercise for 8 weeks, and here's what they found. They saw significant improvements in resting energy expenditure, which means they're burning more calories at rest. Very, very important because we all spend most of our time at rest. And then we also saw increased fat utilization, so they're using more fat as a fuel, another positive adaptation. Improved blood lipid profiles, very big deal. Blood lipids are what are things like cholesterol and triglycerides, so getting them under control is very, very important for heart disease risk, as we all know. Last but not least, we saw decreased insulin resistance. Now this is very significant, particularly for diabetics. Diabetes is exploding, and particularly type 2, which is non-insulin dependent diabetes, is exploding worldwide. There's thousands and thousands of people every day getting diagnosed with this condition, and this condition is fundamentally about insulin resistance. So anything which helps us decrease insulin resistance is going to directly benefit people with type 2 diabetes. This slide does a great job of just showing you the overall effects of eccentric training all the way around chronic eccentric training on a regular basis. We're going to increase the ability of muscles to absorb energy safely. We're going to allow for higher muscle forces, but at the same time, remember, we have a low metabolic requirement, making it ideal for rehabilitation, seniors, and things like that. We're going to get increased muscle size and strength, as we talked about. The muscle is going to become stiffer, going to be able to absorb more force, and if you can absorb more force, then you can produce more force concentrically, potentially, because you can load more energy into the spring. What does this mean? Sports performance. So this slide does a nice job of summarizing what we've talked about. Now, there are existing eccentric training methods other than reACT, and the trainers have done a great job of devising ways to do that, except there's some problems with every other method available. Many methods, such as plyometrics, where we're doing, and ballistic training, where we're being very explosive, or heavy negatives, where we use a very heavy weight on the eccentric side, they pose significant risk of injury, and they require very careful preparation and skilled coaching. There are also systems out there, one in particular that's excellent, called X-Force, which uses a highly specialized system so that during the eccentric portion of the weight training exercise, the weight is actually going to increase dramatically by about 40%. Now, this is the ideal way to train eccentrically. The only issue with that is that this system runs upwards over $100,000 for the system, and this is true of every other similar system out there. So while they're fantastic, they're not practical, they're not going to be deployed, and the other methods we talked about are very potentially very dangerous, which is why people are not training effectively eccentrically. So SAID principle, what is this? What does it have to do with everything? SAID stands for specific adaptation to imposed demand and is the key principle to keep in mind when designing exercise and rehab programs. The more specific the program, the better the outcome. One of the most important aspects of being specific is to include specific conditioning relative to the muscle contraction type based on the movement or sport requirements. So let's give you an example. Skiing is a sport that's mostly eccentric. And so if we want to train specifically, we want to train in a way that's going to improve eccentric muscular function, both strength and endurance, because that's what's required by the sport. So even if we train the legs with, say, cycling, which is going to make legs stronger, it's going to do nothing to address eccentric function because there is no eccentric aspect to cycling. So it may help a bit, but it's going to be way less than optimal because it's not going to be preparing someone specifically for what's going on when they do the sport of skiing. So to properly train a person for activities in sports requiring eccentric contractions, the program obviously needs to include eccentric training. So how are you going to do that? Most activities in all sports require eccentric strength. It's part of virtually everything that we do, so therefore that says that eccentric training should be part of everyone's training program. However, as we talked about, most equipment and programs, there is no effective eccentric loading. So we've been leaving this out of our conditioning programs for the vast majority of people in every area. What are the proven benefits of reACT, using reACT specifically on a regular basis? One, you're going to see rapid increases in muscle mass, strength, and power compared to other training methods. Two, and this is very significant, improved balance, coordination, and kinesthetic awareness. And kinesthetic awareness is another way of saying proprioceptive ability, meaning the person's going to get better at knowing where they are in space and knowing where one body part is in relation to another. That body awareness is another way of saying that. So unlike any other eccentric training system, there are other good ones. This one is specifically going to be functional in that while you're getting more muscle mass, strength, and power, which is great, you're also at the same time improving your balance, coordination, and body awareness, which means you can use the strength that you're developing. So this is the definition of functional eccentric training, which is the only product in this category right now is reACT. At the same time, another thing that makes it very functional is that we have improved core strength and stability. Because you're balancing, and you'll feel this the first time you're on reACT, the core is kicking in, the abdominal and low back muscles are firing to maintain that rigid core position necessary to maintain your balance. At the same time, we're getting injury prevention benefits. Why? The more a muscle can absorb force, the better it can prevent injury. Product's been validated, so reACT is not something that just happened recently. There's over 8 years of research and development in the field through a combination of rigorous testing and consultation. So what are we talking about? We're talking about NFL teams, U.S. Olympic Center at Lake Placid, U.S. Ski Team, Navy SEALs, Gonzaga University basketball team, to name a few. All of these folks have been, how have they been using reACT? A, as a rehabilitation device for injured players, or in the case of SEALs, for injured team members. They've also been using it to condition the athletes to prevent injury, what they would call prehab, and to make them stronger and faster. And they love the product. In particular, the U.S. Ski Team loves it. It's probably the finest way to train for skiing available because it directly strengthens them in exactly the way that's required for them to be better skiers. They have much more eccentric strength and eccentric muscular endurance, both of which are very important in skiing. SEALs use it as well, and the reason it's important for them is they use a boat called a Swift boat to do approaches to beaches, and when you're on a swift boat moving very fast over choppy water, you're standing, and guess how you're using your legs? You're using them eccentrically to absorb the bouncing motion so that your head doesn't get rattled all over the place, your spine doesn't get injured. By the time they hit the beach, they're very tired, and no other form of conditioning is going to prepare them for that quite like reACT. In the case of Gonzaga University basketball team, Seattle Supersonics, other teams that are using this, the old saying is what goes up must come down. When you're landing, that's when you get injured. Landing is all about eccentric strength and endurance. When a muscle's fatigued and can't produce force adequately eccentrically, injury's right around the corner. Also, the more force you can absorb on the way down, the more force you can produce on the way up, so it's going to help them be more explosive as well. These are some of the teams that have been using reACT for quite some time now, so this is a very highly tested and validated product. It moves in a reverse bicycle motion. The platform is going to actually change the pitch during rotation. This is a very complex process to get perfected, and now it is perfected. And what this does is it forces the legs to absorb energy, but at the same time there's no impact. So the joints aren't getting stressed, but the muscles are working like crazy. So it's an ideal form of conditioning. The platform is going to move from a vertical ellipse to a horizontal ellipse. It's moving in that reverse elliptical pattern. There's no impact, but you can get a full range of motion. You also have full control of movement speed, which is one of the key things, because changing movement speed changes the intensity and the difficulty of the work. It's also very safe and secure, so not only can this be used by professional athletes, it can be used by highly deconditioned folks as well, safely.